So what Akerlof and Cranton do, and what we're going to do in this lecture, is start out with a really general framework to think about the economics of identity. And then once they've got that framework in place, right, once we've defined some of our terms, we'll use that framework to create more specific models that we can use to try to understand particular situations. So that's what we're going to do here, right? We're going to start by walking through the framework, then we're going to go through a couple of examples. So as we talked about in the intro, right, the basic idea of this framework is that people's decisions are shaped by their own personal preferences, right? Their intrinsic preferences that we normally think about. They're also shaped by the social categories that a person falls into. And they're going to be shaped by those categories both because of how an individual feels about themselves, right, and feels about their decisions in reference to what categories they belong to, but also how other people react to someone's decisions with reference to the social categories they belong to. Okay, so let's make this a little concrete. So for person J, right, we've got some person. They're going to be defined by the following, right? They're going to have the following attributes. The first thing is that they're going to belong to some number of social categories. Right? These can be things like your race, right? Your gender or sex. They can be things like, your age, things that you have very little control over. But they can also be categories that you do have some control over, right? That you can define for yourself. Things like lawyer or nerd, right? Or athlete. All of these sorts of ways that people describe themselves and other people are going to matter here. And they make this important distinction, which we're not going to mess around with too much. We're going to assume this is all the same. These are going to be as perceived by you, and by other people. Right, so if we want to be fully general, we would want to be able to say that other people might perceive you as belonging to different social categories than you think that you belong to. Okay, so this is the first thing that's going to matter. The second thing is going to be our actions. So these are the things that make up normal economic analysis, right? This is what you actually do. How much time do you spend studying, right? How loudly do you argue, right? What foods do you eat? Where do you go for school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? All of these things that we care about are going to be a person's actions, right? Third thing that's going to matter, we're going to call weirdly epsilon j. This is a person's characteristics. So these are observed attributes of a person that shape the way other people perceive their social category and perceive their actions, right? So we said that social category includes things like race. Characteristics might include things like skin tone, right? Things that that influence people's designation of what social category a person belongs to. And then the last important thing here is going to be what's called prescriptions, or P. And prescriptions are essentially going to be a cultural understanding of the way people ought to behave or ought to be who belong in different social categories, right? So they're essentially going to be people's reaction to actions and characteristics on the basis of social category. Right? So prescriptions might include things like people might believe that women ought to wear dresses and men don't, right? This is an example given in the paper. If that's the case, you might expect, if you're deciding whether or not to wear a dress, that if you're perceived as a man, you're going to get a different reaction than if you're perceived as a woman from wearing a dress, right? You might be receive negative attention for the dress if you're a man, positive attention if you're a woman, right? But an important thing here is that these are not laws of nature, right? These come out of particular social norms, particular social experiences. So those prescriptions might be in place in some societies or in some subcultures, not in place in other societies and in other subcultures, right? These are also going to be, though, as we said, so that's an example of prescription about actions connected to social category. These might also be prescriptions about characteristics connected to social category, right? So if somebody has sexist beliefs about who belongs in different jobs, they might say that women shouldn't be lawyers, right? Or women shouldn't be Marines, right? That's a prescription that says people are going to react negatively to the existence of someone in a social category who has characteristics outside of their control, right, that the person objects to. I guess I should be more careful. I should say the prescription on characteristics would be something like female-bodied persons, right, shouldn't be Marines. People who look like women to the judge shouldn't be Marines. This makes sense? So then we combine all these things, right? The social categories that you either are put in or choose, the actions that you take, the characteristics that you have, right, that you don't have much influence over, and the way society reacts to all these things, and this gives us our identity. So our identity is just going to be a function of all these things, right? A function of C, A, epsilon, and P. And this is going to essentially be how all of this stuff together affects your well-being. Right? So if people are nice to you because you belong to a social category that they like, and your actions and characteristics conform to that, then your identity, right, this is essentially the payoff you get. It would be the positive feeling you get from feeling included, feeling supported. Right? If people are mean to you because you belong in a social category that people don't like or react to negatively, right, or you take actions or have characteristics that don't conform to what people expect of your social category, right, your identity is going to be the feeling of alienation or isolation or the physical confrontations you might experience as a result of this. This makes sense? Then we say that your overall well-being, right, your utility, is going to be a function of a couple things. It's going to be a function of your actions, right? This is what we can think of as your personal intrinsic preferences, right? It's also going to be a function of the actions of other people. Because you too, right, might feel mad if you see people violating the prescriptions that you hold. And it's going to be a function of your identity, right? The costs and benefits you get. That come about as a consequence of your actions, combined with the characteristics you have that you don't control, the identity that you fall, or the categories that you fall into, right, and people's reaction to all of that. Cool. And the one thing I just want to really emphasize here is that this thing we're calling identity, right, this influence of the social phenomena on your sense of well-being, right, on your preferences, is going to be shaped both by, and this is important, right, both by how other people react to you, how other people treat you, but also how you feel about yourself, right? How much you like or dislike being placed in different social categories, placing yourself in different social categories, how much you like or dislike, how uncomfortable you feel with disconnects between the social categories you belong to and the actions that you take. Okay, great. So let's take this and use it in a really, really simple framework, right? Where we want to think again about people's decisions to conform or not conform to other people's expectations. So let's start out with a situation where everyone shares a social category, right? And each person's deciding, do I take an action that conforms to that social category, or do I take an action that violates the expectations of that social category, right? Do I do what people expect of me, or do I do something different? So I'm going to give an example that, forgive me, I haven't spent a lot of time on Oxy's campus when there's students around, so I might not have the culture right, but that I think is pretty true to Oxy's student culture. So let's say everyone shares a category, which is, category 1 is Oxy student. Oh my gosh, O without Oxy, student, right? Everyone shared category. And let's say, it's the annual Frisbee Golf Showdown between Oxy and the hated Claremont McKenna, right? And so, as you guys do, from what I understand, everyone's expected to show up on campus wearing orange and waving an orange foam finger, right? So 2 possible actions. Right? The first possibility is to wave an orange foam finger. Right? And then the second possibility is to refuse to wave a foam finger. Right? You're going to come without any sort of Oxy regalia. Right? And we're going to say that there's a prescription right, which is that Oxy students should choose action 1. Make sense? Okay. Now we're going to say that there's 2 players in this game, right? The first player is a fan. And they're going to choose whether to have a finger. Right? The second player, I'm going to call the enforcer. So this is a different Oxy student who observes whether or not you're wearing a finger, right, in accordance with the norms of your society, and is going to decide whether to punish you for failing to conform to expectations. Does this make sense? Now, for fans that actually want to wear the foam finger, right, there's really not going to be anything for us to think about. They're just going to go ahead and wear the finger. So let's imagine a situation where the fan would prefer, in terms of their own preferences, right, their personal payoff is lower if they wear the finger than if they don't. Right, so let's imagine the fan basically has 2 choices. Right, they can either conform, right, wear the finger, or not, right? And we're going to say that they get a higher personal payoff from refusing to wear the finger. Now, once the fan makes this decision, right, the enforcer has a decision as well, right? So they're going to decide right, are they going to yell at this person, right, demand that they show fealty to Oxy, make a big scene, or are they going to let it go, right? So not punish or punish. Okay. So from the fans' perspective, they're going to get payoffs from this situation from a couple of different places. Right, so the first thing that's going to matter from a fan's perspective is they're going to get their personal payoff from either doing what they want to or not doing what they want. Right, so we're going to say that if they refuse to wear the foam finger, they're going to get a payoff V, right, where V is personal preference. If they decide that they're going to wear the finger anyway, they're going to get a 0, right? They're not going to get the satisfaction of not looking stupid with their foam finger. Make sense? Now, on the other hand, even though this person doesn't enjoy wearing the foam finger themselves, they might have some personal payoff, right? Some intrinsic value of doing actions that are consistent with their social category, right? So the fact that they're an Oxy student, that they identify as an Oxy student, is going to mean that they're going to pay some social cost, right? Internal social cost. They'll feel a sense of conflict within themselves from not doing what everyone thinks they should do, not conforming to the expectations of their social category. So they're going to have a cost IS, which is going to be the internal cost or self-cost of violating identity. Right? So they're not going to lose IS if they go ahead and wear the finger. They are going to lose IS if they decide to refuse to wear the finger, right? Regardless of whether this norm is enforced externally or not. Cool. So this is all the stuff that comes just from the fan's decisions, right? How about the enforcer's decisions? Well, we're going to say that the enforcer is going to have some cost IO from observing, right, another person violating their expectations. Right? So we're going to say that if they observe another person violating the norms and they choose not to punish that person, they're going to end up with a payoff of negative IO. Right? They're going to be upset that people aren't showing sufficient school spirit on Frisbee golf day. Right? That's going to have them walking around mad all day. However, if they decide to punish, then they're going to have a cost C, which is going to be the cost of punishing. But they no longer suffer the cost of IO. In other words, right, from their perspective, if they yell at or throw an egg or something at the person they see not wearing a foam finger, that resolves the unhappiness or frustration that they experienced from seeing a norm violation. Right? Another way to think about this might be, maybe the cost IO is the cost of everyone else seeing you let someone get away with violating the norm. Right? If you go ahead and punish that person, then you're not violating the norm of enforcer anymore. This make sense? On the other hand, right, if the person isn't wearing the foam finger, they're not going to pay a cost IO, but if the person is wearing the foam finger, they're not going to suffer any cost from not punishing them. They would just suffer this cost negative C from punishing. Cool. And the last thing that's going to matter here is that from the perspective of the fan, if the enforcer decides to punish, the fan is going to have a loss L. Right, the loss from being punished. So we'll have here, right, if they're punished, their payoff is going to be V minus IS minus L. Does this make sense? So just to be clear about what we're doing, right, this upper number here, this is going to be the fan payoff. The number down here is the enforcer payoff. Cool. Okay. So given this setup, right, given the framework we've laid out, what's going to actually happen, right? Is the fan going to wear the foam finger or not? Right? Are they going to get punished or not? So as you guys might remember, the way we're going to try to solve problems like this, right, which we call sequential games, meaning a game where one person makes a decision, and then the other person reacts to that decision by making their own decision, right? In other words, the enforcer knows whether you wore the finger or not before they make the decision about whether to enforce, is we're going to solve this with a process we call backward induction. What this means is, we're going to ask, given each of the circumstances, the last player finds himself in, right? Given each circumstance the enforcer finds himself in, we can say what their best decision is, right? Once we know that, once we know what the enforcer will do if the fan wears the finger, and what the enforcer will do if the fan refuses to wear the finger, then we can say, well, if the fan knows how the enforcer is going to react, which of those two situations is better from the fan's perspective, right? So in other words, we're going to start with the last player and work our way back to the first player. Okay. So what's the enforcer's decision going to be? Well, if the fan decides to wear the finger, the choice is incredibly obvious, right? Then the enforcer decides, do I want a payoff of 0 from leaving this person alone? Or do I want a payoff of negative C from punishing them for no reason, right? In this case, it's clear. The enforcer's best decision is going to be to not punish. What this means is the fan's payoff from wearing the finger is going to be 0, right? Because the fan knows that the enforcer isn't going to punish, so therefore the fan payoff is going to be 0 from making this decision. How about on the other side, right? When's the enforcer going to punish if the fan refuses to wear the foam finger? Well, the enforcer is going to decide, is negative IO greater or less than negative C? So punish, refuse. They're going to punish, right, in the case when negative C is greater than negative IO, right? When their best move is going to be punished. Right, which is going to be the same thing as saying when IO is less than C. Right? What this means is when the negative sensation of seeing somebody get away with violating a community norm, right, is more upsetting than the cost of punishing them for violating that norm, you're going to end up, the enforcer is going to end up punishing the person for violating that norm. Otherwise, they're going to leave them alone. Cool. So let's imagine. Well, so now let's turn to the decision of the fan. Right? The fan's going to want to know, when is it going to be worth it for me to refuse? When is it not going to be worth it for me to refuse? So we need to think about two circumstances here, right? One where they know they're going to be punished, one where they know they're not going to be punished. Right? So if IO is less than C, right? In other words, if I know that the enforcer's best move is to punish, then I'm going to ask, am I better off here, where I know that I'm going to be punished? Right, so my payoff will be B minus IS minus L, or am I better off here, where my payoff is 0? Right, so they're going to refuse B minus IS minus L is greater than 0. In other words, if the benefit they get, right, from not wearing the stupid foam finger is greater than the internal pain they feel from violating their prescriptions, plus the punishment they expect to suffer from others from not doing what's expected. Right? And then on the other hand, of course, if IO is greater than C, right? In other words, if it's not worth it to punish, then they're going to expect to get a payoff of just V minus IS from refusing, right? So they're going to refuse if V is greater than IS, right? If I don't expect to be punished, I'm going to refuse to wear the finger as long as my personal feelings about the finger are stronger than my personal feelings about not conforming to expectations. Okay, so that was fun, right? So what did we learn from this little exercise? Right, what does this tell us about the evolution of social norms? Well, it's going to tell us a few things. The first thing that I want to highlight here is that if we think about someone's decision to conform to a social norm that they personally don't enjoy, right, do something that they wouldn't do absent social pressure in order to adjust to social pressure, we're going to say here that there's two motives, right? There's the internal motive, right, how it feels to violate your own sense of identity, and there's the external motive, right, what you expect other people to do to you in response to you violating their expectations for your identity. So what this means, right, one of the things I really want to highlight is even someone who doesn't care at all, right, who has no IS equal to 0, right, has no personal sense of commitment to wearing the foam finger on Frolf Day, still might be influenced by norms around identity, right? These prescriptions can still shape people's behavior, even if people don't internally care about the prescriptions assigned to them whatsoever. Another thing that's useful to think about here is to think about what sorts of interventions in this situation could lead to different outcomes, right? If we thought that it was bad for a fan who doesn't want to wear the foam finger to wear one anyway, how could we change this situation in order to get a nonconformist outcome? There's a couple things we could do, right? One thing that we could do is we could influence the enforcer's payoffs, right? For example, we can make it really, really costly to punish, right? If we said that students caught egging nonconformers, right, who weren't wearing foam fingers, were going to be expelled from the university, we could make C large enough so that it would no longer be in the enforcer's interest to punish a shared norm, right? And that would, of course, lead fans who don't have an internal sense that that they ought to follow the norm to do what they actually want to do, right? We can also influence decisions, right, by shaping the extent of punishment. Again, maybe making it easier, making it easier for fans who don't want to wear foam fingers to be away from stadium on game day, right? Or by shaping people's perceptions of themselves, right? Cultural messaging that influence either the anger someone feels at seeing a violation of norm or influence people's internalization of norms could also lead to differences in behavior. This all makes sense? Cool. So where we're going to take this next, right, in the next video, is we're going to think about a richer model, where in addition to thinking about how people make their decisions given the social categories they belong to, we're going to think about how people choose social categories in circumstances where those categories result in different payoffs from their decisions.